I'm Erik Townsend. My presentation today is titled Beyond Crypto, the Future of Digital Currencies. What I'd like to do is start by revisiting a topic that is no stranger to the MacroVoices community, and that is the question, how long the US dollar can hold on to its title as the world's global reserve currency. Now, that's something we've discussed quite a bit on the MacroVoices podcast. In fact, we ran a 5-part special at the end of last year titled The US Dollar Endgame. So far, we've discussed that topic entirely from a macroeconomic analysis perspective. What I'd like to do today is to add a technology dimension to that same conversation. Okay, why a technology dimension? I think that it's very likely that the US dollar will eventually be replaced as the world's global reserve currency by a digital currency. Now, I know what a lot of you must be thinking. Holy cow, Erik, that's a 180. You're the guy who's been critical of cryptocurrency. Well, actually, I still am. I don't think it's a cryptocurrency. I think it's what comes next after cryptocurrency. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, since most of you know me as the host of a macroeconomics podcast, I should probably mention that my first career, I was actually a technologist in the software industry, and specifically, I was a distributed systems architect. So the technologies upon which cryptocurrency and digital currencies are based are actually extremely familiar to me, and I have quite a bit of experience with them. What I'd like to do today is to lay out a roadmap of where I think we're headed in the long term, not just this year and next year, but over the next 10 to 20 years. Well, if it's a roadmap, obviously it has to start with where we are today, and as you know, that's cryptocurrency. I'm going to put cryptocurrency technology in perspective, but only how I see it fitting into a much longer term story, because as big of a craze as it is right now, I think that cryptocurrency is going to have a limited life, and what's going to be a much bigger trend will actually be government-issued digital currency, what some people in the crypto community call FedCoin. In the long run, I think the ultimate end game is a government-issued digital currency replacing the United States dollar as the world's global reserve currency. But I don't think we can get directly from here to there. In order to get there, I think there's a prerequisite, and that is that we need something I'm calling a digital sovereign bond market. So I'll explain why I think a digital sovereign bond market is a prerequisite to eventually the end game, which is the US dollar being replaced by a digital global reserve currency. So let's start by putting cryptocurrency technology in perspective. Crypto was invented anonymously by someone going under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. And Satoshi did 3 really important things. Number 1, invented a brand new idea, a brilliant invention called distributed ledger technology. Number 2, perfected the invention of double spend-proof digital cash. And number 3, created the world's first digital currency system, designing it intentionally to limit the ability of government to regulate, oversee, and control the financial affairs of private citizens. I'm going to have more to say on this, but I just hit you with a whole bunch of technical terminology. So let's precisely define these terms before moving on. I want to distinguish digital payment systems from digital cash. I want to introduce the concept of distributed ledger technology and explain what it is. And I want to distinguish digital currency from cryptocurrency. Let's start with digital payment systems. A digital payment system is simply an electronic payment that works like a check. That means that it has to clear the bank, and that means that the recipient of that payment has to consider the possibility that that check could bounce. Examples of this are ACH and PayPal. These systems have been around for a long, long time. There's really not a lot we need to say about them. Digital cash, on the other hand, is an entirely different animal, and it's a new invention. It's an electronic payment that has the characteristics of a cash payment rather than a check payment. So imagine I had a $100 bill and just randomly gave it to somebody in the audience, someone I don't even know. Well, once you've got the $100 bill in your pocket, it's a done deal, baby. There's no way for me to stop payment on the check or cancel the charge with my credit card company. You got the $100 bill. It's over at that point. It could be anonymous. I may not know who you are. You might not know who I am. You can't do those things with a check. digital cash, just like real cash, gives you the ability to do that. And furthermore, digital cash can be stored on electronic media or transmitted through a network. So I can email digital cash to you even in another country. Or I could take $100 worth of Bitcoin, which is a fraction of one Bitcoin, and store it on this little USB drive. Now there's $100 of cash value stored in this little USB flash drive. I toss it into the audience. Whoever catches it effectively receives that $100 of value. The gentleman raising his hand. Don't get your hopes up. I'm not going to do that. What's really cool is not only can I put actual cash value onto digital media, I can make a backup copy. I can have 2 copies or 3 copies. Well, let's suppose that I have 3 copies on 3 flash drives. It's not $300. It's 3 copies of the same $100. Well, how does that work? Any one of them could be spent, but as soon as one of them gets spent, the others are instantaneously and automatically worthless. And that happens automatically without having to update the data that's written to the drives. Now, from a software engineering standpoint, that's a pretty good trick. And it's made possible by another one of Satoshi's inventions called distributed ledger. Entire books have been written about distributed ledger. It's a fascinating topic. You could go on for hours about it. We don't have time. So I'm going to give you the really high-level overview. For the entire history of the computer industry, the way information systems have been designed is depicted on the left side of this diagram. There was some central point of control, a database that had all the information. Somebody was in charge of that database. They owned it, they administered it, they controlled it. Even if it's a distributed system with lots of computers in a network, all that's really going on is they're going through the network to access that centralized storage of information. It's the way everything's always worked. Distributed ledger is a brand new idea, shown on the right side of the diagram. It says the data itself is replicated across the entire network. Every computer has a copy of the database. And furthermore, there's a very elaborate handshaking system between these computers so that if any one computer tries to hack or tamper with that data, change it in some way, the other guys in the network will notice that that's happening and they will reject that invalid version of the data. The result of all of this is you end up with a hack-proof distributed database that has no central point of control and therefore no central point of failure. This is the enabling technology that was needed in order to implement double spend-proof digital cash, the idea of being able to store actual money in digital media in a way that it cannot be double spent, even though it can be copied to backups and so forth. Now, the distributed ledger system, which underpins the Bitcoin cryptocurrency, is called blockchain and is obviously very well known. There's a problem, though. Blockchain is dependent, at least in its current version, on something called proof of work. It's an just incredibly inefficient way of doing things. Well, okay, what's the problem with proof of work? What's the big deal? What's wrong with it? Frankly, we don't have time today to get into it. But at the end of last year, I wrote a 20-page white paper on that topic specifically. So if you want to know what's wrong with proof of work and why I think we eventually need to see blockchain replaced by a different distributed ledger, read the white paper. The URL is on the screen. It'll be in the handouts that you receive. That's as much time as I have to cover it today. What I want you to remember for today is distributed ledger comes in 2 flavors. The original flavor is called a fully decentralized distributed ledger. The example is blockchain, invented by Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever that is. The whole idea here is it's incredibly inefficient. It's slow as molasses. And this is precisely the reason you've heard these statistics about how the Bitcoin network consumes more electricity than entire nations. It's because of this thing called proof of work. The thing is, it's totally, completely decentralized. There is no central point of control whatsoever. And that makes it possible for them to design the Bitcoin cryptocurrency to be government tamper-proof. It's impossible for the government to shut down Bitcoin by finding the central server in the middle of the network and shutting it down because there is no central server at the middle of the network. Now, they've already invented another flavor of distributed ledger, which is thousands of times faster and more efficient, and that's called a permissioned distributed ledger. It goes thousands of times faster than blockchain. Just one little catch. It is a centralized design, and that means it's possible for the government to shut it down. Well, hang on a second. What if you are the government and you're designing a government-issued digital currency system? You're not concerned with preventing yourself from tampering with your own system. You don't have that problem. Therefore, you can use a permission-distributed ledger, and you have the advantage that the technology already exists to go orders of magnitude faster and more efficient than blockchain. Let's now define digital currency. When we talk about a digital currency, we're not talking about a digital payment system like PayPal that makes a payment in an existing currency, such as US dollars or euros or rubles or what have you. We're talking about an actual currency system which is implemented in a digital network. So creating such a system is coining money, creating new currency that didn't exist before. Any currency system needs to meet the tripartite definition of a money system, which is to say it provides a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. That's the conventional definition of money, and Bitcoin meets that, as do the other cryptocurrencies. Transfers in this kind of system could be cash-like, the way Bitcoin works. They could also be check-like, the way PayPal works. I think where we're ultimately headed is to digital currency systems that offer both cash and check-like payments. Technology offers the opportunity to go way beyond what was ever possible before. I want you to remember, technology is a two-edged sword. What we've seen so far is only one edge of that sword. We've seen a bunch of cryptocurrency visionaries who have a very libertarian philosophy say, let's use technology to minimize the power that government has to mess with private citizens and to monitor and control their financial affairs. Let's use technology to make it hard for the government to do that. Recognize that technology is a two-way street. If you're the government and you're designing your own digital currency system, you can use technology in the other direction and design it to give government more power than it's ever had before to monitor, control, and oversee the financial affairs of private citizens. A cryptocurrency is a digital currency. It's a kind of digital currency, but it's a little bit narrower in scope. So let me define exactly what I mean by that. It's a digital currency that uses a fully decentralized distributed ledger, like blockchain. The reason they do that is to make it government tamper resistant. It offers cash-like properties, like Bitcoin. It can be stored on digital media, but not double spent. And for now, if it runs on a proof-of-work validated blockchain, it is slow as molasses. This is why the Bitcoin network consumes all of that electricity and goes so slow. Now, just as aviation had to break through the sound barrier and eventually gave us supersonic flight, I predict that somebody will eventually break the proof-of-work barrier and figure out how to design a fully decentralized distributed ledger which doesn't have this limitation and goes as fast as a permission-distributed ledger. As of where the technology exists right now, today in 2018, if you want to go much faster than blockchain, you have to give up proof of work, and the expense that that comes with is some degree of centralization in the network. Let's come back to the slide I left off on before we took that little detour on terminology. Satoshi did three important things. Invented this brilliant new idea called distributed ledger, perfected the invention of double spend proof digital cash. People have been working on digital cash for decades. They couldn't figure out how to overcome that double spending problem. If I've got two copies of the same cash, how do I make sure it's impossible for it ever to get double spent? Distributed ledger is the technology that Satoshi used to solve that problem that had perplexed engineers for decades and made possible double spend proof digital cash, and therefore made Bitcoin possible. But what I really want to focus on is the third point. Satoshi didn't just create a system like PayPal that makes payments in existing currencies. Satoshi created a new currency system. In other words, what they did is coining money, creating new currency. Now here's the thing that I really want you to remember. It's one of the most important points in my entire presentation. For thousands of years of monetary history, coining money has been a privilege that has been restricted exclusively to government. They've never let anybody else do it. In the case of the United States, the authority to coin money is conveyed to the federal government by the United States Constitution. And I think it's no coincidence that that authority appears right up front in Article 1. It's that important because government derives an incredible amount of power from its exclusive authority to coin money. They've never let anybody else do it. Well, wait a minute. It's been 10 years now that Bitcoin's been around. The cryptocurrency community has been coining its own money for a solid decade. So what does that mean? Has the government changed its ways and changed its opinion? Or is it more likely the case that the government is so slow and screwed up they haven't really figured out what's going on yet, and they don't realize that libertarians hiding behind pseudonyms are coining their own money and designing currency systems to compete with government currency by using technology to prevent government from doing things that government thinks are its job? I think that's more likely the explanation. So how does this conundrum get resolved? I can think of 4 possibilities. As I get into them, though, I really want you to focus on the first one, because this first one is the one that the crypto community, with its self-appointed leader, John McAfee, these people are acting not like, hey, we hope this will happen, but they're acting like this is a certainty. We know for sure this is where it's headed. So as I describe the first scenario, ask yourself whether they're being realistic. In this scenario, which I call Satoshi wins, crypto conquers the world, governments around the world finally accept what libertarians have been saying for decades, which is that the private sector is better suited than government is to coining money. Now, that's something that governments have resisted for thousands of years, but apparently, according to John McAfee, that's all going to change. Now, it's not just anybody in the private sector that they're going to suddenly allow to coin their own money. No, who gets this opportunity is going to be a bunch of libertarians hiding behind a pseudonym who have designed and engineered an electronic system whose advertised purpose, that nobody's hiding, there's no hidden agenda here, is to make it very difficult for government to do the things that the government thinks are its job. That's who they're going to give license to coin money indefinitely. I'm a little bit skeptical of that. Under this scenario, cryptocurrency continues to flourish and eventually dominates the global financial system. The governments around the world stand down from their mission to fight terrorism by monitoring everyone's financial transactions, and they say, Satoshi, thank you for showing us the error of our ways. The financial affairs of private citizens are none of our business. We're going to stop trying to monitor these things and respect the right of the people for government to stay out of their business. If you believe this scenario, I have a bridge that I'd like to sell you. What's going on here? Why is everybody taking that scenario to be a given? I think what's happening is people are making the age-old mistake of taking something that is technologically possible, that they think is a really good idea, that is, a money system that is created by the private sector that keeps the government out of our financial affairs. And they're assuming because they like it and they want it, that that means it's actually going to happen in real life. Our job as investors is not to assume that what we want is going to happen. I'm not in charge of the world, neither is Satoshi. My job as an investor is to evaluate the social mood, the political climate, the regulatory environment, and decide what's likely to actually happen in the real world. And I don't think governments forgetting about terrorism and allowing people to coin their own money is a likely outcome. So let's consider another unlikely scenario, which is that crypto is outlawed and forgotten forever. In this scenario, governments wake up, figure out that libertarians hiding behind pseudonyms have been coining their own money for a full decade, and outlaw it. Well, before going on, I need to dispel a really important myth that exists in the crypto community. People will say, no, dude, you don't get it. The whole idea is Bitcoin was designed to make it impossible for the government to outlaw it. They can't outlaw it. There's nothing they can do about it. That's why it's so cool, man. I disagree. There's actually a lot of truth to part of that argument, but it's presented out of context. The truthful part is Bitcoin is a network that operates over the internet. It was designed by some really smart people who could easily conceal those protocols and hide them and make them difficult to detect if they wanted to. So outlawing the existence of the Bitcoin network would be extremely difficult. That's true. On the other hand, what they don't tell you is it would be extremely easy for the government to simply outlaw the conversion of fiat currency into or out of cryptocurrency. As soon as you've done that, so it becomes illegal to exchange your bitcoins for dollars or to exchange your dollars for bitcoins, you have effectively outlawed cryptocurrency. And it would be very easy to implement that kind of legislation. So don't let anyone tell you it's impossible for the government to outlaw cryptocurrency. What they would do is outlaw the conversion of cryptocurrency into existing fiat currencies. Under this scenario, digital currency is forgotten forever. I don't think so. I think the cat's out of the bag. I think the world has seen that there's something possible with digital currency, and I think it's going someplace. Furthermore, the group of people who stand by far the most to gain from digital currency technology is governments themselves. Well, if government themselves is who stands the most to gain, why haven't we seen them creating their own digital currency? Because they're really slow and inefficient and bureaucratic. They're government. It's going to take them a while. So let's consider where I think we're headed, which is scenario 3. Government steals the idea, wakes up, recognizes that they stand more to gain than anyone else from digital currency, but that they need to design it with the opposite attributes of Bitcoin. They outlaw cryptocurrency after recognizing the threat it poses and develop their own central bank issued digital currency systems. What began for the crypto community as a libertarian pipe dream ends in an Orwellian nightmare, as government-issued digital currency systems are designed with the exact opposite design goals of Bitcoin, so that every single transaction can be monitored, traced, and controlled by government. I am not for one instant suggesting that I personally endorse or think these are a good idea. That's not my point. My job as an investor is to look at who's got the power, who has the authority to make things happen, and what's likely to happen in the real world. And I think that as soon as government wakes up and recognizes, number one, what's already happened, and number two, how much opportunity there is to advance their own agenda, I think we're going to see government-issued digital currency. The thing is, the government, look at what happened with the Obamacare registration website. They couldn't even build the website. They're that screwed up. So I don't think the government is going to be engineering their own digital currency systems on top of permission-distributed ledgers anytime soon. That takes me to the final scenario, which is where I think we're ultimately headed. Notice I say ultimately. I've never known the government to go directly from point A to the smartest point B in one step. They usually try every mistake first before they get there. But eventually, I think where we're headed is to a point where governments firmly reassert that coining money is a privilege restricted to central bankers and governments, and libertarians are not allowed to invent their own money. Sorry. I'm not saying I like that. I just think that's the reality we're headed to. But they acknowledge that the private sector is far better suited to advancing technology. So they lay down a new set of rules. And the new set of rules are, it's okay for the private sector to invent digital currency systems which have the capability of coining money and regulating the supply of money. But those features that coin money and regulate the supply of money must be reserved for the exclusive use of central bankers and governments. The private sector is not allowed to do that. Now, if you think about it, this is nothing more than an extension of a precedent that's been in existence for 50 years. Only the Fed is allowed to create dollars. I'm not allowed to create more dollars. But the Fed didn't build MasterCard and PayPal and American Express. The private sector built that. So I think that what we'll see is the private sector builds the digital currency system, the technology, but the government will lay down rules that say if you want to build a digital currency system, it must be designed in a way that reserves to the government the authority that the government is used to having reserved to itself. So let's talk about the market for cryptocurrency and the market for government-issued digital currency. The market for cryptocurrency was created by a group of pioneering visionaries, absolutely brilliant people who invented distributed ledger and double spend-proof digital cash, brilliant inventions that I am convinced will change the course of human history. But remember, They did it in a certain way. They did it in the context of this libertarian system that is designed to intentionally prevent government from being able to do the things that the government thinks are its responsibility and its job. That creates secondary markets. You've got people like Iran and Venezuela skirting sanctions, looking to cryptocurrency, criminals, money launderers, people selling drugs on the internet using Bitcoin payments and so forth. That's not what it was designed for, but those markets exist as well. And of course, from a cultural perspective, the millennial generation has taken a strong liking to cryptocurrencies. Let's now talk about, so that's it for cryptocurrency. It's a huge thing right now. It's obviously getting a lot of attention. But let's consider what the market is for government-issued digital currency. This is a market that hasn't woken up yet. They don't know that they're a market yet. But who would benefit from the existence of government-issued digital currency? First of all the globalists who desire a single world currency. That desire would be satisfied by a global government-issued digital currency system. All of the central bankers around the world who want to outlaw cash. Now, the excuse that they usually cite for wanting to outlaw cash is it's necessary to fight terrorism. Frankly, I think their real motivation has a lot more to do with tax enforcement and the desire of central bankers to be able to use negative interest rates as a monetary policy tool, which really requires banning cash in order to make it possible. In any event, the desire to ban cash can be satisfied if there is a government-issued global digital currency system. Every government around the world who would like to see the US dollar lose its stranglehold on world reserve currency status, and that's a rapidly growing list. It starts with China and Russia at the top of the list. The rest of the BRICS countries are on it. Iran and Venezuela just became charter members in the last few months. There's a lot of people around the world that are getting more and more frustrated with what they feel is the United States government abusing the authority that it gains from being the world reserve currency issuer, and they want to see an alternative. All of the BRICS governments who would like to see an alternative to SWIFT. Okay, what the hell is SWIFT? SWIFT is the world's international wire transfer network. So if you think of the US dollar is the international trade settlement currency, okay, it's a currency. How do you send payments in that currency? You use the SWIFT network, and it really is the backbone of international commerce. Well, the U.S. government has made this contentious recently because what they're doing is they're withholding access to the SWIFT network as a way of imposing sanctions on countries like Iran, and they've threatened to do the same thing with Venezuela. That leaves an appetite in the mouths of the BRICS governments saying, we really wish there was an alternative that was not under the thumb of the United States government to the SWIFT system. If someone other than the United States government were to assert a government-issued global digital currency system, that desire would be satisfied. This last one is the most important one, and frankly, it's scary. All of the governments around the world who would like to see digital currency work the exact opposite way from how the current generation of cryptocurrencies work. So the currency system is designed to make sure that for every penny of wealth that exists on the face of the earth, the government has the ability to monitor and control exactly who has it, where they got it from, who gave it to them, under what circumstances they got it, when they got it, and to have an audit trail that goes back years so that tax enforcement authorities, law enforcement, and so forth can all go back and look at the history of what any individual on earth has done. I am not for one instant saying that I personally condone or endorse this as a good idea. I don't. But if I look at the world we live in, where governments around the world are very passionately engaged in a fight against terrorism, in which they very firmly believe it is not only their right and authority, but their duty to monitor everyone's financial transactions and look for suspicious activity, I think that governments are going to recognize that technology is a double-edged sword. If you can design Bitcoin to take power away from government, you can design digital currency to give government power that it's never had before. So I want you to ask yourself three important questions. Number one, which market is bigger? Is it the cryptocurrency market and the band of millennials who have made it so popular? or is it all of the governments and central bankers of the world combined? Number two, which market is controlled by people with more power and influence over the global economy? Is it John McAfee, the self-appointed leader of the crypto community? Or is it Jay Powell and Mario Draghi and Kuroda-san? I tend to think the central bankers have more power. Number three, and by far most importantly, who stands the most to gain from digital currency technology? Is it the people who invented it, or is it the governments who could use it in the opposite direction to advance their desire to be able to monitor and control the financial system much more closely than they're able to today? I think that it's much more true that the government is who stands the most to gain. But there's a really, really important dichotomy here. And that is that group number two, the people with all the power, are clueless. They're out to lunch. They haven't even figured out what Bitcoin is yet. They don't get it. So these people are anything but technology pioneers and visionaries. They don't know what's going on. They haven't even figured out what cryptocurrency is all about. I think this sets up a very interesting two-phase dynamic. For the next few years, I think cryptocurrencies and the whole crypto movement is going to continue to flourish and gather momentum. Why? It's not because governments have decided to change their ways and allow libertarians to coin their own money. It's because governments are so bureaucratic, inefficient, and stupid that they haven't figured out what's going on yet. Eventually, they're going to wake up, and when they do, I think they're going to outlaw first-generation cryptocurrencies, and they're going to contract with private industry to create government-issued digital currency systems that have the exact opposite properties of current cryptocurrency. Let's come back to the question I began with, which is how long the US dollar can hold on to the title of global reserve currency. I think that a government-issued digital currency, perhaps one issued by a government other than the United States, is likely to be what takes that title away from the dollar. Well, before we can go further into that, we need to more precisely define exactly what we mean by reserve currency status. If you ask most people what that means, they'd tell you it's the currency in which international trade is settled. Okay, that's a true statement, but I think the far more important definition is it's the currency in which central bank reserve assets are denominated. So let's cover both of those definitions in the next couple slides. 200 or 300 years ago, it was super important to have a single currency as the global trade settlement currency. Because if you didn't do that, the only other option was literally to fill sailing ships up with gold and send them around the world to go buy up all the currencies that you would need to deal with all the different countries. It was a logistic impossibility. We live in a day and age now where international forex transactions occur at the click of a mouse in a few milliseconds. It's just not important anymore to have a single currency as the world's global trade settlement currency. Well, if that's not so important, how is it possible that the US dollar has managed, even despite the failure of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 when Nixon slammed the gold window, even as we see the petrodollar system, which replaced it, crumbling around us as we speak, how is it possible that the US dollar has been able to keep its monopoly on global reserve currency status? I think the answer is actually very clear. The answer is there simply is no viable alternative to the United States Treasury market for central bank reserve assets. Okay, let's come back and do a little review here. Central bank reserve assets, what are we talking about? We're talking about the piggy bank or savings account for an entire nation. The assets that they keep because if they needed to in a crisis, they need to be able to sell them in a hurry to raise cash, to buy their own currency, to defend their currency in a crisis. What's more important to them than anything else when they go to buy a reserve asset is they know that someday they might have to sell it in a hurry. They might have to just dump it at the market in size, and they want to do that without moving the price needle very much. Nothing compares to the United States Treasury market in its ability to absorb really, really big cash flows without changing price. Well, wait a minute. Why is that true? It's true because nobody has ever stopped and thought about it and said, hey, you could use technology to design and engineer a digital sovereign bond market which is designed from the ground up with the express design goal of exceeding the U.S. Treasury market's ability to absorb central bank-sized capital flows. You could use technology to design a digital sovereign bond market whose fundamental purpose is to be able to absorb large cash flows. And my contention is, even if you're starting with a much smaller market capitalization than the U.S. Treasury market has, which would normally be the main thing that affects its depth and liquidity characteristics, I think you can use technology to exceed the depth and liquidity characteristics of the U.S. Treasury market, even if you're working from a much smaller capital base. And I'll explain a little bit more in just a minute. So let's go now to my vision of where we're ultimately headed with digital currency technology. My vision of this begins with a foundational level, which is the digital currency system itself. It's a global digital currency system which is created by private industry, but the ability to coin money and the ability to regulate the supply of money, those functions are reserved to central bankers. And it's the exact opposite of Bitcoin, where Bitcoin is designed to take power away from central bankers and say, hey, let's fix the money supply in Bitcoin so it's impossible for central bankers to try to do quantitative easing. I think that this digital system is designed to offer central bankers even more capability than they're used to having in conventional systems. And it's furthermore designed to give law enforcement and tax enforcement officials the ability to oversee and regulate the global financial system with more authority than they've ever had before. I do not personally endorse this as the best thing for humanity, but if I evaluate the world that we live in, including the social mood that exists, you and I might have one set of values and beliefs. I think most MacroVoices listeners are probably not a good representative of the mainstream of society. The reality of the world we live in is we're moving away from individual liberties more toward collectivism. Younger generations favor socialism over capitalism. We're in an environment where a lot of people think that the government should be given more power, not less. And I think we're headed not toward Bitcoin replacing the dollar as the world's global reserve currency, but rather governments waking up and saying, hey, we could engineer a digital currency that is superior to all conventional currencies, so superior that the world will move to it, and that will allow us to take that title away from the US dollar. And I think that's where we're headed. I'll have more to say about each of these colored blocks in just a minute, but let's start with the high-level view of the architecture. Next, you need a clearing international payment network, a replacement for SWIFT, so that you can, the SWIFT network, by the way, doesn't actually clear and settle any payments. It's just a message delivery system between bankers. They have to settle the actual transactions using their own systems. With digital cash technology, you could build an international payment network that actually transmits value over the network and instantaneously clears and settles those payments. It would be dramatically superior to SWIFT in many ways. The next one, though, is the most important point in my entire presentation today. If your goal for this green block at the bottom is not just to have a digital currency system because it's cool, but you want to design a government-issued digital currency system that has a crack at taking the title of global reserve currency away from the United States dollar, I contend it is impossible to achieve that goal unless you simultaneously deliver a sovereign bond market, a digital sovereign bond market, which matches or exceeds the depth and liquidity characteristics of the United States Treasury market. If you can do that, you're giving central bankers what they need to justify moving away from the US dollar and denominating their central bank reserve assets in your digital currency system. I'll have more to say about it in just a minute. Finally, it's possible to also build a digital securities market that replaces stock and bond markets around the world. I'll have more to say about that in just a minute. So let's go with more slides into detail on each one of these colored blocks, starting with the currency system itself. It's government issued. I'm sorry, Bitcoiners, it's not my favorite answer either. But I think that's who's got the power, and I think that that's where this is headed. Government is not going to let private sector coin its own money. They're going to realize that's what's going on. My personal belief is the only reason that the crypto community has gotten away with coining their own money for the last decade is it's technology, it's confusing, and the government doesn't get it. They don't know what's going on. They don't understand it yet. They're going to wake up and figure it out someday. I see a digital currency system which is designed and engineered by the private sector, but which gives government and exclusively government access to the functions that government is used to having exclusive license over. It's based on a permissioned distributed ledger system, which means that it is thousands of times faster and more efficient than a blockchain-based cryptocurrency. I don't think there's just one of these things in the history of the world. There's likely to be two major competitors. Think Coke and Pepsi. You know, there's competition. Usually two major contenders emerge. If I had to guess how this goes down, it starts with someone other than the United States government, probably either China or Russia or a combination of China and Russia working together, asserts a new government-issued digital currency system which is designed and marketed as an alternative to the US dollar. There's a lot of people around the world that would like there to be an alternative to the US dollar, so they design it for that market. When they do so, it causes the US government to react and say, uh-oh, this actually threatens that hegemony that we've enjoyed for the last 75 years over the financial system of the world. We better do something. And they respond with a digital US dollar. And those two compete over, you know, who knows how many years for this title of global reserve currency. I imagine a system which offers both check-like and cash-like payments. There are useful application scenarios for both. There's also something, it also supports both bank accounts as well as the idea of digital cash, being able to put your currency on digital media that has value just like cash, that's anonymous, that you can give to someone, and so forth. There's another idea I call offline cash, which I don't have time to get into in today's presentation. It's basically designed to deal with the situation of needing to conduct small transactions out in the wilderness when you're not connected to any network, you're 100 miles out in the Canadian Rockies someplace and you want to buy a Coke. There's a way to do that transaction without being connected to a network. The system is designed to be scalable to hundreds of millions of transactions per second in real time. Remember, what I used to do for a living was architect large-scale distributed systems. This would be the largest scale distributed system ever conceived. It's a massively parallel distributed system that supports every transaction on the face of the earth. Every time anybody in the world buys a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread or pays their fare to get on the subway train or the public bus, or you drive under the sensor on the highway that charges you for the toll road, those are all transactions in this system that are getting cleared in real time on the distributed ledger. It is a massively high performance, high availability, parallel system, and it would be fascinating to work on designing it. It supports everything from sub-penny microtransactions to billions of dollars. They're all transactions, payments in the same digital currency system. I predict that the way things are likely to go is that its design will be more Orwellian than libertarian. It will be the opposite of Bitcoin. I'm not hoping for that. I'm not asking for that. But if I look at the reality of the world that we live in, once governments figure out that they can control this and that they have the ability to design their own digital currency systems, I think we're headed in a direction that would make Satoshi sick to his stomach. Think the opposite of Bitcoin. I envision this global currency system being ready to take over as the world's only currency at some point. But I think probably it's designed in what I'm calling a zoned architecture that allows monetary policy zones so that within a given central bank's area of geographic jurisdiction, the ECB has the authority over what the money supply is in Europe. The Fed has the authority over the money supply in the United States, and so forth. Well, wait a minute. If you have different money supply zones, that potentially creates the possibility of value imbalances between the zones. So how do you resolve those? Do you do it the way Europe did the euro currency with the Target 2 system to track imbalances, but you keep a fungible unit of account? Or do you actually allow exchange rates to develop between zones? I don't pretend to have answers to these rhetorical questions today. My point is a lot of work needs to go into designing what could be just fascinating as a distributed systems guy to work on designing this. There are monetary policy tools that become possible using digital technology that were never possible in conventional currency systems. That could be a good thing in many ways. Frankly, that's not what's on my mind right now because it's the other ones that are not a good idea that scare the hell out of me. Consider, for example, that there are people in government who sincerely believe that saving is immoral. They believe that anyone who owns any wealth has a social obligation and responsibility to the rest of society to promptly spend that wealth back into the economy so that that money goes to support the economy and create employment and prosperity for other people and so forth. Please don't get me started on how strongly I disagree with that myself. I would go on for an hour. The point is, what happens if we wake up one morning and find out that some genius politician has decided that our life savings should work like airline frequent flyer points, so that your savings have an expiration date, and if you don't spend them before the expiration date, they expire worthless? Well, that's about the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life. Who's good at taking stupid ideas and turning them into laws? So I really am concerned. There is so much that could be good for the world. We could do so much to advance the world with digital currency technology. I think that if government were to get out of control, it could also do some pretty scary things. I don't know how this is going to get worked out. It's not a technology challenge. It is a social challenge as to how we're going to balance how much power technology gives us versus how much power technology gives to government that maybe we don't want government to have. It's going to be a very interesting time to see how this all works out. There needs to be a clearing international payment system. That is the layer of functionality which replaces SWIFT. Now, the Bitcoin community would say, you don't need that. It's just like any other payment. It's the fact that it's international is irrelevant. Well, that's because Bitcoin was designed around a minimalist philosophy that says we're trying to take power away from government. I think governments are going to insist that they have a bunch of powers that they're used to having. They're going to want to be able to impose national capital controls. They're going to want to be able to impose sanctions, trade restrictions, tariffs, and so forth. In order to enable those kinds of government control functions, you need to add a layer of functionality above the currency system itself to facilitate international payments. That's what I'm calling a clearing international payment system. And again, the word clearing is because it can actually clear and settle the payment instantaneously using digital cash, something that SWIFT is not able to do. The next point is the most important one in the entire presentation. Frankly, I could go on for an hour about this easily. We don't have time for that. And it's the digital sovereign bond market. So again, what are we talking about here? If you want your currency system to have a crack at replacing the US dollar as the world's global reserve currency, which I think is the big prize that governments around the world ought to be focusing on, there's no way you're going to succeed at that unless you can offer a sovereign bond market that can match or exceed the ability of the U.S. Treasury market to absorb central bank-sized capital flows. Well, think about the way equity markets have been re-engineered in the last few years to use liquidity rebates to incentivize market participants to supply liquidity to the market at times when they wouldn't have otherwise been inclined to do so. Take those kinds of technology innovations and just extend them and imagine designing a digital sovereign bond market from the ground up where the software engineers are told, look, the goal is this market's got to be able to absorb central bank-sized capital flows and do a better job of it than the U.S. Treasury market can. What technology innovation can we think of to incentivize market participants to always supply liquidity so that there's always a bid there to catch that whale-sized central bank liquidation trade that they need in order to defend their own currency in a crisis? I contend that even if your market capitalization is much smaller than the U.S. Treasury market, you can use technology to still deliver superior characteristics. There are thousands of possibilities for how you could also use technology to enhance the funding process itself. I don't have time to get into them, so I'm going to just give you one very small example. Please remember, it's just one of dozens of possibilities. I call this a smart contract revenue bond. Take a country like Venezuela that's been through hell in the last few years. Someday, the Maduro regime will fail. They'll get a new government, and their highest priority will be rebuilding their oil infrastructure, which is very badly damaged. Well, if you're an international investor and you're contemplating buying those government bonds that are issued by a brand new government, you really got to scratch your head, because that new government could fail and you could end up with those bonds being defaulted on before the ink printed on them even dries. So the only way you can justify that investment is with a really high risk premium. That translates to the government of Venezuela for a really high cost of borrowing, and that translates for the Venezuelan people to more years of human suffering beyond what they've already endured. On the other hand, suppose that you had a well-engineered digital sovereign bond market. The way this might work is that when the rest of the world wants to buy oil from Venezuela, their biggest export, they send money and they get a tanker full of oil in return. But this digital currency system, which is integrated with the digital sovereign bond market, says, hey, wait a minute, this payment address for oil payments to Venezuela, there's a sovereign bond that has a claim on it. It's a smart contract revenue bond that has a claim on this payment address. And the smart contract gets invoked. And the terms of that smart contract say Venezuela is not allowed to receive oil payments unless they are current on their external debt payments to outside creditors. It's one of the rules. The system says, uh-oh, looks like the new government of Venezuela missed a coupon payment. It automatically diverts a portion of that oil payment directly to the investor, making him whole on his investment so that the country's external sovereign debt is now made current. At that point, the rest of the payment is sent on to the Venezuelan government. This creates a win-win situation for all parties involved. The investor knows he's going to get paid because even if the government of Venezuela fails, the next government will have to satisfy the requirements of that smart contract that exists on the revenue bond. That means that the investor can justify a much lower risk premium. That translates to a lower cost of borrowing. That translates to less human suffering for the good people of Venezuela. This is just one of dozens of possibilities of how you can use technology to deliver things that were not possible with conventional sovereign bond markets. There are dozens of others. So the question I want you to ask yourself is, what would it take for the whole world to abandon its 75-year-old standard of assuming that everything in the emerging market is denominated in US dollars and underwritten by US banks, and move to a whole new, completely different system? My contention is what it takes is game-changing technology that doesn't just offer a different currency system. It offers a completely new set of capability that never existed before. What would the ramifications of this be? Frankly, I'd have to talk to Jeff Snyder and Luke Groman to get my head around what the implications would be if all of that emerging market debt were suddenly redenominated in something other than US dollars. All those US dollars are being repatriated, coming back home. That creates a crisis for the US government. This next one, a global securities market. I'm going to just summarize this slide because I'm running out of time. It's possible to use technology to do really cool things, to cut out the middlemen and make it a better deal for the investor. But wait a minute, I've got to invoke the same criticism that I levied earlier on the crypto community. Remember when I said they were guilty of taking what they want to happen and what they know is possible with technology and assuming it's going to happen in the real world? Well, if you could design a digital securities market that cuts out all the middlemen, or you could use technology in the other direction and design a digital securities market that perpetuates the role of the middlemen and gives them an even bigger slice of the pie, which one do you think Goldman Sachs is going to make sure actually gets built? So I'm not too optimistic, but technology certainly makes possible the replacement of a lot of our equity and bond markets with a digital system that would allow peer-to-peer transactions between natural buyers and sellers. I'm just not too optimistic about it actually happening. So who's going to design and build all this stuff? I invoke the analogy of a space race very precisely, so let me explain. The US-Soviet space race, in that race, space travel had been anticipated for more than 100 years by science fiction writers and futurists and so forth before it ever happened. But nobody took it seriously. It was the stuff of comic books, little green men from Mars, ray guns, flying saucers. Nobody took it seriously until October 4th, 1957, when the Sputnik satellite orbited the Earth and the US government said, oh crap, it's not science fiction, it's science reality. It's happening now, and the Russians are ahead of us. 3.5 years later, Yuri Gagarin was the first human being to orbit the Earth, and the race was really on. So what does any of this have to do with cryptocurrency, or with digital currency? I think the analogy here is we're still in the science fiction phase where nobody's taking it seriously. Just like space travel in the 1950s. You ask the government, what about digital currency? Oh yeah, we know all about it. Yeah, millennials, Xbox, goatee mustaches, ride sharing, cryptocurrency. Yep, check, They have no idea what it is. They have not figured out that these people are coining their own money and designing systems to compete with government-issued money. When they figure it out, that's when I think the game changes. So my expectation is things happen very slowly. Crypto continues to flourish until governments figure out what's going on and recognize the opportunity to advance their own agendas using digital currency technology, and then suddenly the space race is on and it's between governments. It opens up some interesting questions about the relationship between government and technology companies. Government, I do not think, will forfeit control of coining money. The government, on the other hand, can't build their own systems. So I think about the defense industrial complex, which President Eisenhower so famously warned us about decades ago as he was leaving office. Are we setting the stage for the modern day equivalent in the form of the central bank fintech complex? Is there going to be a very corrupt power structure between government and industry that creates all of these money systems? Is it going to be designed for the best interest of the people, or will there be special interests and corruption and so forth? It could be scary. I think about this in terms of how does somebody who knows how to build something that's really cool enter this market? I'm a tech entrepreneur. That's my background. I'm a distributed systems architect. I have a design in my head for everything I presented to you today. I know how to go and build it on top of a permission distributed ledger. Well, what if I were to go call my VC friends, raise some money, spin up a company to do this, and built everything I described today? Who would I sell it to? China and Russia? Would that even be legal? Would I want to do that? Would I sell it to the US government? They haven't even figured out what Bitcoin is. So, how is this all going to play out? It's going to be really interesting. My conclusions: cryptocurrency will probably flourish for a while longer. I don't think it's over yet. It doesn't end until governments realize that they have so much more to gain than anyone else, but they need to take control and use technology in the other direction. Will it be 5 weeks or 5 years before governments wake up and realize that people are coining their own money and designing systems to compete with government-issued currency by designing them to prevent government from doing what it thinks its job is? I don't know how long it takes. Eventually, I think that they wake up and the biggest demand for digital currency technology will come from governments. Once it's coming from governments and they're not worried about government tamper-proofing it, they can use permissioned ledgers and they can do things that are much bigger in scale than what's possible today with cryptocurrency. I think it will have the opposite set of characteristics of what Satoshi conceived. The grand prize in this whole story goes to the government who is astute enough to recognize that they can use technology to create a digital currency system which can replace the United States dollar as the world's global reserve currency. That gives the issuing nation a huge amount of power in the world. Generally speaking, when a new currency takes over as the world's global reserve currency, it's at least 50 to 75 years that it holds that title. So we're talking about somebody building a digital system which eventually takes on reserve currency status and holds it for the next 50 years. It's a really, really big deal. My contention is the secret sauce, the magic ingredient that makes it possible to win at that game, is delivering the digital sovereign bond market. That's my time. I look forward very much to continuing this conversation with all of you in our town meeting forum later on this afternoon. Thank you.
You've got elevated levels of construction, raised rates 17 consecutive times. The only thing that changes that mentality is losses. So the question is, where are we on that path, and are we yet at a dangerous place?
How cyclical resource companies really are. A swing of 50% down or 100+% up, it is actually the base case average. How many of you want to see what we found out?
The warnings have gone on and on. China is building ghost cities, and the US is repeating the 2008 mistake. Baiting these so-called gurus has increasingly become the best strategy out there. Why does it make sense to keep betting on the financial system imploding on itself?
Global economic growth is just not possible without global monetary order. It was never really about subprime mortgages. No matter what scheme the Federal Reserve cooked up, and there were several, to avoid having to answer some very hard questions.
And it's a matter of the U.S. national security to not allow China to move away from the dollar-centric system. QE that the Fed didn't have to call QE. I used to do a little, but the little wouldn't do it, so the little got more and more. This seems to be apropos here.
If there's anything that we can improve on for our next event, what would you say that would be?
Oh, you have to arrange it closer to Finland.